the kinds of dwellings we built, which were a function very much, a function of the places that we called home. And all of this knowledge was born of this practical activity. And our lifeways are marked with this. Our customs, our habits, our ceremonies, all signify, this kind of symbiotic relationship I've described in activities that are very practical, day-to-day activities. And so Indigenous realism for me is something that I think we need now more than ever on the planet. And I think every one of you has an opportunity to be engaged in positive ways to sort of undermine what I first might characterize as a sort of technological insulated ignorance that modern industrial man, and certainly I should say mankind or humankind, exhibits, and certainly those people that are in post-industrial societies even more so. And what do I mean, an insulated ignorance? What I mean is basically the fact that, we spend so much time indoors, we spend so much time looking at flat screen images of all kinds of places out of doors, and even images of our friends and our family in this time of COVID, that basically we become inattentive to the world outside our walls. We become inattentive to weather. You don't pay any attention to the weather as long as your phone or your iPad or your computer works, because you'll just get your weather app and you'll find out what it's going to do. Well, we have people on the planet who, believe it or not, still make their weather forecast by paying attention to what's going on in the world around them. And I think that's what I mean by this insulated ignorance, a sort of a experiential ignorance that we have. The irony, of course, is that we're supposed to be all using this modern technology and becoming, much more intelligent and really knowledgeable about the world. But therein lies part of the problem, is that the kind of flat screens that we're looking at are really a very pale reflection, and for the most part, usually an interior projection of the world that humankind has shaped very predominantly. Okay, so I think this challenge that we have today, and it's a very real challenge, is once we get past this COVID virus, is to figure out how to encourage people to, again, get out of doors and begin to experience the world around them. I think there's roles here for everyone. There's roles here for K through 12 teachers. There's roles here for university professors. We've got so much evidence that one of the best things, one of the best, if you will, medicines for many of the problems that modern humankind faces, depression, anxiety, various kinds of neuroses, is to simply quit looking at the room full of mirrors where all you see is human produced environments, and move to that larger environment. And you can do this in cities, you can do this in small towns, you can do this anywhere. But I think it's really a challenge we have right now to get experientially plugged in again to the world around us. Now, I know probably I've got, some Purdue environmental science or ag students. I hope, biological sciences, ecology students watching this. I'm sure what I'm saying is not new to you, but what I want to emphasize is that the work the really heavy duty work we have to do in addressing the challenges we face are basically projects out of doors. That we really are going to have to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty and begin to, rebuild relationships between peoples and places. And if we do so, I think what we can do is we can exercise within this framework of what I call indigenous realism, some indigenous ingenuity. So let me talk a little bit about it. So I kind of wanted to frame my comments that way, and then let me talk about kind of four basic points that I think all weigh in favor of people beginning to take seriously indigenous wisdom, indigenous worldviews, and thinking about how we might use some of that understanding to address the very complex problems that we are facing on the planet today. So, point one, it'd be easy enough if we were facing one problem. Right now, we've got crises layered on top of crises. So we've got, at this point, largely unmitigated climate change occurring across the planet. We're seeing it with these incredible uncontrolled crown fires of the Intermountain West and the Pacific West. We're seeing it with the droughts, continuing droughts of the Southwest. We're seeing it with the, extreme weather events across the Great Plains, and the increased hurricane activity in the Atlantic and in the Gulf. And everywhere you look, of course, there's been on the other side of the world incredible typhoon activity this last year, probably one of the most difficult things that we're going to have to do. And we need some of you really young, bright people who love the water and like working with computers to really work on this challenge of modeling what's happening to the warming oceans and seas. We have a pretty good idea of the big scale issues. We have a very difficult challenge connecting what's happening in those larger ocean currents to what that means to people in Shizmerov. What's that mean to people down on the Gulf? What does that mean to indigenous people in Hawaii? What does it mean to indigenous people in the Caribbean and on Puerto Rico, which has experienced some very severe weather and hurricane activity in the last couple of years? So there's just that, we've got that crisis, we've got a COVID pandemic, we have economic institutions that seem to be working very well for a few and very poorly for the many. We have a crisis of government, not just in the United States, but across the world now, Russia, Hong Kong, the relationship between Hong Kong and China. Everywhere you look, we have, Middle East, Eastern Europe. We have these questions about, governance, what good governance is. And unfortunately, it seems like we're living in a period where some of the underlying assumptions about democracy itself are being called into question. So it's everywhere you look, we're facing these multiple crises. So I know a lot of you probably have been introduced to this term, these wicked problems. That's one way scientists have used shorthand to talk about these problems that have so many variables, so many factors. They're wicked problems. They're very complex problems. Um, Climate change is exactly a wicked problem. It has so many dimensions to it. It has the land itself, what's going on in terrestrial systems. It has what's going on in ocean systems. And of course, we all know how important atmospheric science is in trying to get a handle on what's going on. And when we start talking about how we're going to deal with it, we know that it's not going to be an earth scientist who's probably going to be the best person to figure out how you respond to these changes. I can tell you all about the changes, but maybe not so much about what kind of communities, what kinds of houses, what kinds of economies, where is it reasonable to take steps to mitigate climate change, or where is adaptation really something we need to consider, or in some cases, do people need to start making plans to move because of what's happening on coastlines around the globe today? All of these, so many dimensions, economic dimensions, food, housing dimensions, biodiversity dimensions, education dimensions. And so that given, here's my argument for why each one of you should learn to think as Indigenous people did. We had an advantage because our knowledges were largely experiential and based on very practical lifeway questions of how we would feed ourselves, how we would clothe ourselves, the kinds of homes we would build. I would argue those are precisely the kinds of questions we're going to ask ourselves right now, because we can't keep doing what we've been doing. That there's some advantage to looking at people who never thought in boxes and who never developed silos for their knowledge systems. As my good friend Roger Pawardi at NOAA, a climate scientist, a climate modeler, likes to say, if we want to be honest, those of us in the academy, we have to admit that part of the problem is this: the world has problems and we all work in places that have departments. And this is the challenge. Higher education is going to have to really step up things and start finding some leadership so we can start having people work in cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary ways to address these very complex problems, because they don't lie in any single domain. Let me talk about an area that I think is very real now, and once we get past sort of the depression, I guess, that some people are feeling of this social isolation with COVID, I think we're going to have to confront the fact that many people are beginning to report literally clinically observable behaviors that seem to be the result of an anxiety about the future based on climate change, that people are overwhelmed in amongst all of these crises, and like, okay, so what? We're done for, right? What are we going to do? What am I going to do? How am I going to be able to deal with any of this? So we're addressing it here in Lawrence, Kansas, where Haskell Indian Nations University and Kansas University is. And we've got a kind of a proof of concept small grant where we're working with Douglas County, the city of Lawrence, Haskell, and KU to really put that front and center of how do we deal with the affective aspects of how climate change is impacting people. And I think that's a very legitimate topic. So, and it's a very real situation people are experiencing. So I think that we've got opportunities now if we can really think outside boxes and think rather in relational terms about the realities that we share, that we have there's some reason actually for mild optimism. Because once you begin to realize that you live in a world full of relatives, not resources, all of a sudden you begin to realize what, again, those of you who came from farm families maybe, or still maybe come from a farming family, you know that 2 generations ago, certainly 3 generations ago, family farms were a function of good relationships, good neighbors, extended families, okay? And people all pulled together when things were really bad and tough. And I think we've reached that point now. Again, the advantage of thinking indigenously about this is the solution's not up to us. See, that's the old anthropocentric way of thinking about knowledge. Oh man, how are we going to solve this? Well, we're not going to solve it unless we start paying a lot of attention to the places where we live, what's going on, what's happening, and then start to think indigenously about how we try to live more fully, more richly in that place we call home. That is, once you start thinking that way, you can start to think about exercises of indigenuity. So I would argue, point one, that, and I want to point out that, you know, there are large organizations, scientific, you know, organizations and institutions that recognize this now. Working right now with folks from the National Center for Atmospheric Research and UCAR on putting together a major proposal to bring indigenous knowledge holders, people who live on coastlines, together with some of the best earth scientists in the world to address the challenges that they are facing. So NASA, NOAA, NSF, places like the National Center for Atmospheric Research are beginning to really say, hey, yeah, maybe we should be working with indigenous people, not because they are in the front lines of experiencing existential threats due to climate change, but actually from a strengths perspective that we believe the indigenous people might know something about those places that could help us downscale some of our understanding of these large systems. We have a pretty good idea on what can happen, but how does that express itself on the coastline of Louisiana? How does that express itself in Puerto Rico? How does that express itself in Alaska or in Hawaii? Well, I think a good place to start, if you want to downscale that knowledge, is talk to the people who have hundreds and thousands years old histories of living in that place and understand that place in that deep experiential sense that I'm talking about. So I think there's some opportunities here. We're going to have to be brave. We're going to have to be bold. And some of it is we'll have to cut through some of the institutional obstacles that universities and research institutions build to doing this kind of research. Everyone's all for the interdisciplinary research until a faculty member goes to his chair and says, hey, can I get release time to go teach this course with an economist or with a clinical counselor, or I want to do this this course on air quality with a psychologist and a recreation therapist. And all of a sudden, you know, the chair and the dean go, well, if you can find the money to cover that, yeah. But we don't want to invest in that kind of activity. That's an obstacle. That's an institutional obstacle. So we've got a lot of work to do, and there's work for everyone. So think about, and I know people at Purdue do a lot of research in this area. Think about our food systems. Think about how we're going to feed people on the planet, where we have increasing numbers of people due to the fact that climate change is making places on the earth that have had a very thin margin of being able to be productive with just these slight, you know, increases in temperature and changes in rainfall, no longer habitable and supportive of any kind of agriculture. We know where those people are moving. They're all moving to cities. They move to urban areas. Think of the issues that we are going to be facing in future years. So you think about food, you think about water, you think about biodiversity, you think about education, okay? And I think there's work for everyone right now. We've got all kinds of work that people can be engaged in. And so my second point that I would make is that if we start thinking indigenously about the world and things that we are facing, I think it's going to open some doors for some really unique research opportunities, where we start really modeling, you know, what true interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary work looks like. It's not easy. It's hard. We're very good at talking about it. We're just not really good at doing it right now, because we don't do it very much, okay? This is the classic distinction that John Dewey made between knowing and doing. You know, you can know something, but can you do it? And of course, Dewey was pretty orthodox. He believed if you can't do it, then you really don't know it. And I think we're getting to the stage now where we can really start looking at some of these things. What would my third point be that I'd like to make today? My third point that I'd like to make is that this is a real challenge for those of us that consider ourselves scientists and like to increase knowledge, improve our knowledge and understanding of our human place in the world. The most important feature, I think, that we have to hold on to is humility. I think a lot of the challenges that we're seeing in the world today is that, you know, no one likes know-it-alls, at least not in my community. The know-it-alls are the people you move away from as far as you can. Why? Well, because our experience teaches us the world's a very complex place and no one knows it all. And for this feature alone, I think we need to inculcate a sort of humility in all the work we do. And I think there are times when we have to say, we don't know. Here's what we do know. Here's the best forecast we might make, but things can change. A very complex system we're talking about here. And I think having this character of humility is really, really important right now, particularly when we have so many people that seem to want to question science, that want to question, any kind of leadership we have in dominant institutions, education, religion, government, for sure. And I think that this attitude of humility can really work to build some credibility across our institutions. And that's what I always liked about, people like Bill Tallbull, Northern Cheyenne elder I worked with, Pamina Yellowbird, a woman I've worked with, and those two individuals, I always remember they'd always begin anytime they talk about something, said, "Well, I can only tell you what I know," and that is so crucial because, by the way, we have institutions that sort of try to reinforce a different idea, not intentionally, I don't think, but it has that consequence. So, there's this old story among the Indigenous people of Canada when they were going through some of their treaty rights legislation to restore treaty rights in Canada. And there's a story of the elder that gets invited to go to provincial court to be an expert witness, right? And he should have been an expert witness. He knew the land, the river valleys, the mountains better than anyone. So he goes to this court and they swear him in, right? What does he do? Well, he raises his hand. "Do you swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?" And this elder goes pauses a minute and goes, "No." And the judge goes, "What?" And he says, "Sir, do you need a translator? We have translators here. Did you hear the question?" And because he couldn't believe that this old man would say no. And the man indicated, "No, I'm good." And so the judge instructs the bailiff again, "Let's do this one more time. Raise your hand. Do you solemnly swear to tell the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?" And the elder kind of this time takes a pause and looks to the judge and says, "No, I can't do that." And the judge is exasperated, goes, "We're only asking you to tell the truth." And he says, "No, you asked me to tell the whole truth, and all I can do is tell you what I know." That's indigenous humility. We can't know it all. We don't know it all. And so there's plenty of work for everyone right now, given the challenges that we're facing. So my third point would be, indigenous realism. You have to own up to the fact that we human beings aren't the center of the universe. It's not all about us. And we need to quit living in rooms full of mirrors where all we look at is ourselves and the things that we've made, and reconnect ourselves to a world, much larger world out of doors. And once you do that, you get very humble because you realize how small you are in the big picture. And I think that's a good thing. Okay, so I've got just enough minutes here, I think, to make my fourth point here, and then we can maybe, have some questions and some dialogue. So I want everyone to hear me out on this final point. I've been asked several times, okay, so what does this, how do you encapsulate this? So I've been thinking about my 2-minute elevator speech. You have someone for 2 minutes and you got to really sell something. What are you going to say? Well, here's my final point. It builds on the 3 points I've just made, okay? Number one, if you want to think about a fundamental way of having a paradigm shift, imagine this. Imagine what it would mean if we stepped outside our doors after this and we looked around the world and we acknowledged not resources, but relatives. Well, then you would be thinking indigenously. In fact, you'd be more consistent with evolutionary biology than the way people used to think about the world pre-evolutionary theory. We are all related. We ought to honor our other than human relatives. That's point one. We would move from a world fixated on managing resources to a world of living well with relatives, number one. Number two, if you do that, then we could leave behind this infantile fixation we have on rights. Now, I want to be very clear about this. Indigenous people have as much respect as anyone for individual autonomy, if you will, liberty, than any peoples I've ever met. But their experience in a world full of relatives, human and plant and animal relatives, has taught them that any fixation on inalienable rights is hollow or shallow without an equal acknowledgement of the inalienable responsibilities we have. We have people who won't even wear a damn mask because you're violating their inalienable right. What about responsibilities? Don't you have any relatives you care for? If we could move from a world fixated on resources and translate that into living in a world full of relatives, if we could leave behind our fixation with just rights and counterbalance that with inalienable responsibilities, I think then we could start to really shape an exciting discourse, a discourse not about civilization, a discourse not about progress, both very anthropocentric terms, I mean, to be honest with you, and start thinking about resilience. What does resilience look like in a world where humans are engaged in promoting systems of life enhancement? Not human enhancement, not just human comfort, convenience, and profit, but where we lived in a world that was much richer because we understood that we lived in a larger moral, political, ethical, spiritual universe than just a human inhabited one. That we have basically the opportunity to build systems that promote systemic life enhancement on the planet. Everyone's talking about systemic change right now, and I believe Indigenous Realism offers us an opportunity to engage in systemic change. I believe that we can solve some problems using indigenous ingenuity or indigenuity. And I think the payoff is going to be a healthy, growing biodiversity on the planet, as opposed to a declining, denuded planet of biological life and ecosystems. So that, to me, is Indigenous Realism. And there's hope because we're not in it alone. We've got to begin to listen to what our mother can tell us. This planet has lessons to teach us yet, if we'll just pay attention. Thank you very much, everyone. I'd love to hear questions, comments. But I think I'll call it a wrap right there.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wildcat. Just really good information. I was vividly taking notes, and really good information that you shared with us. As far as questions, I know we've had a couple of comments that are in the chat area. So
cool.
If you want to because if anybody has any questions, I think we have time. So I see Matthew with his hand up. Let me see who else. Maybe we'll go ahead and go with Matthew here. Oh, let me see. Matthew. There you go. Can you, I think you're on, go ahead and unmute yourself, Matthew, and you can go ahead and ask your question, Dr. Wildcat. Are you able to unmute yourself, Matthew? Maybe Deb, I think Deb is able to.
Yeah, we'll see if we can get you unmuted, Matt.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. He says, I was just using the applause emoji. Okay. Not a problem. So I'm going to go here. If anybody would like to just kind of raise your hand using the under the reaction, you can raise your hand and we can unmute you to ask the question. Okay, Patrick, you're on. Go ahead.
Hey, so Jay Sango, my name is Patrick Freeland, Windclam, Muscogee Creek Nation. Really good to see a lot of you I haven't seen in quite some time. Flicka, thanks for sharing this event. And Dr. Wildcat, always a pleasure to see you. And always appreciate that story. I've been actually literally just told that this morning at a Indigenous Peoples Day event out here in Washington. So one thing that I always, again, because you always talk about this idea that there's a way of understanding something, but then when you experience something. So I think that my experience at Purdue was that, came with a sense of urgency about adaptation to climate change, but it reminded me of like going to the edge of a beach and seeing a tsunami wave coming. And instead the focus was like, all right, we're going to get microscopes out. We're going to look at these little grains of sand to see how, they happen to change during, an incoming tsunami. And then I know that I work with a lot of students now among others and elders who were even sharing this morning about the challenges of an education environment, predominantly white institution, Western academia, et cetera. And so we were really speaking about this idea about Native peoples re-engaging education and re-emphasizing story. But I remember reading in your book in the Power and Place, and then mentioned that comment a little bit earlier about this concept of technological homelessness. Would you be able to maybe chat a bit about that and how, and like, especially there's a lot of Native students that are here right now, and just really kind of connect that to that, that missive of adapting to these wicked problems.
Right. Yeah, I think so. So here's when I wrote Power and Place back in 2000 and 2001 with the late Vine Deloria Jr. We were both very, fascinated with what was going on with technology. I mean, that was a point where by that time everyone, was getting laptops and computers, and I guess smartphones were underway or in place. And I wrote Technological Homelessness with this notion of it was maybe the first iteration of this idea of isolated ignorance. That one of the challenges we have with the technology is because we get so fixated on it, and it's engineered, right, to keep us constantly looking, hitting the next button. I mean, people track this. These search engines are designed to pull you in, right? And technological homelessness for me was this statement that, you know, we all use these kinds of metaphors or ways of talking about this today, you know, that, well, you can work anywhere now. Okay. Well, okay, I can work anywhere. I've got my laptop, I've got my smartphone, I can work anywhere. Well, okay, you can work anywhere. But because you can work anywhere, does that mean that you really don't that you pay no attention to nowhere? That we start to live in a nowhere land. Again, I'm dating myself, but a popular band in my era, the Beatles, wrote a song, "He's a real nowhere man. He can live in nowhere land. He's a nowhere place." We seem to kind of have a popular culture now that we're somewhere, but we're nowhere. The malls that people shop in, the kind of suburban development that continues largely unabated, okay, where, you know, when it gets right down to it, you know, they all have the same kind of layout. The houses all look nice and neat. And we know you'll have a little shopping place next door where you'll have, you know, your Whole Foods and your Starbucks. And you'd be any place in the United States. And if you've got enough money, you can find that place. And that's the problem. It loses any character of the place. So in that sense, people don't have homes anymore. They have a house, they have a postal address, but I've argued they are literally homeless. They are technologically homeless because they don't have this connection to place any longer. And I think that's a reality. And I think it's something we need to be aware of. And there are people, by the way, you know, in planning, urban planning, development, architects, people who are really starting to think about this. And I think that's a great area, by the way, where we can see some real innovation, because we know that people, you know, like to, you know, my age would tell you, hey, what am I looking for? I'm looking for a place where I could walk everywhere. Could I walk to the grocery store? Man, that'd be great. I don't want to drive. Okay, but we build out our urban and suburban sprawls in such a way that I don't want you trying to cross Interstate 70 in Kansas City on foot, because you're going to have a very good chance of not making it to the other side. That would be very dangerous. And so we've divided up our cities with all these traffic ways and freeways. Well, you may be technologically homeless and not even realize it. But I think increasingly people do begin to realize that, you know, they would like to be connected to a place, a sense of place. And so thanks for asking the question, Patrick. But now that I think of it, you know, that was kind of my first, I think, foray into this question of what now I would describe as, you know, this isolated ignorance, that we isolate so much with ourselves, with our technology, that we forget that there are places other than the rooms full of mirrors where we basically reside, to larger spaces and places in the world.
Great. We do have a question in our chat box I want to go ahead and pose, but from Alexandra. What do you do about people who are skeptical about Indigenous knowledge because it does not follow conventional Western scientific practices?
Yeah, well, I think this is really a good question, and here's the way I would answer it. Now, I work closely with some of the best Western trained scientists in the world. And here's what I would say. Some of those scientists get it. And what they get is that just because you can't put the kinds of questions our ancestors raised necessarily and dealt with in the environments they lived in experimental boxes, doesn't mean they didn't have knowledge. And what's interesting today, and I guess this is why maybe scientists now are looking more to indigenous people, is we can't put climate change in an experimental box either. We can't have a controlled experiment that's going to tell us about climate change. Why? It's wicked. There are just too many variables. It's a real world problem. And I think a lot of the most pressing problems we have, food, housing, health, government, these problems require people to be able to think about processes, people, and the Hopi can raise corn in places where you would never think you could grow corn, but they grow it in a very particular way that fits that place. That how did they gain that knowledge? Well, they didn't go down to Walmart and get it out of the Old Farmer's Almanac, and they didn't get it at Purdue University. They got it by living in that place for hundreds of years, paying attention and seeing what worked. Now that is akin at one level to a scientific method. And I think that's something to consider. Thank you for that question.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you so much for that answer. I have Dr. Maury Levy on that would like to ask a question. So if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, Dr. Levy.
Yes, I'd like to perhaps speak to a melding of methodologies, Western and what is described as Indigenous Realism. And the example I would give is, it's not done yet, the beginnings of the transformation, restoration of living spaces, food, energy, water in Puerto Rico.
Mm-hmm.
And there is I can't recommend the entire program because it's a lot of rich people having fun, but there's a thing called Down to Earth on Netflix with Zac Efron and a nutritionist. But the episode on Puerto Rico is telling, and it's because it involves the mayor of Puerto Rico, who's quite a person. And because of what I will describe as their indigenous knowledge of their island and what can be done there and the resources and the interplay between peoples there is a blending of that information with aspects of modern technology, including solar panels for replaceable energy, collection of rainwater. I mean, it's not that they don't have water, it's they don't have good water. Reduction in air pollution, and in the farming area, because of climate changes, there are places where they cannot grow what they used to grow because of insufficient water or too much water or hypersalinity, the whole story.
Right.
So what they have gone to is to reduce the space using hydroponics. And they grow selected plants that essentially from production to table, Now, again, this is a microcosm compared to New York or Indianapolis.
No.
I understand the scale issues in
Right.
all of this, but at least there's an attempt to meld information about interactions with the environment with certain modern technologies.
Mhm.
And I saw a question in the chat, how do you convince people, how do you go about this shift?
Mhm.
And I can only tell you what I know. I don't know how to do this. But what impressed me was the projects they conducted as examples and expositions of what could be done.
Right.
Now, the place is still a disaster.
Mhm.
The Hilton Hotel, if you see this episode, it's 3.5 years into its reconstruction, not using modern technology with the exception of plant walls.
Mhm.
So getting rid of air pollution and sprucing out the place. But at least they got started. And so they're replacing bamboo and shell metal construction with masonry and concrete and solar panels, etc.
Mhm.
They're demonstration projects. That's the word I meant to use. And in that way, they can demonstrate both to potential donors, because money is still an issue,
Mhm.
what works and what will be sustainable, because the hurricanes are coming back. That's just the point I wanted to make. There is a potential to meld indigenous realism and aspects of modern technology, at least in demonstration projects. Thank you.
I can't tell you how much I appreciate your comment, because this is one of the challenges you have. I have when I talk this way, so there people might not realize that I am all for an application of technology. I just think we need to reframe it. And so I think that exactly the kind of thing you're talking about is really ripe for demonstration projects. In fact, I've been in a couple of national forums in the last 3 months on this, and I'm really thinking that right now that's the kind of funding we need. We have people who have a pretty good sense, because they've lived in these places, they know what they're facing, they know what the changes they're seeing, have a pretty good idea that things aren't going to go back the way they ever were before. And I think those people working with people who will listen to them about those appropriate technologies, applied technologies, that we need someone who would just step forward and start funding these demonstration projects. And I think that's a good term to use. I think we should have just demonstration projects all over the United States, and let people who have ideas in communities lead the research, work with those scientists, work with those engineers. And I think that's what I'm excited to see tribal colleges moving towards, is that our programs are going to be very, very hands-on, demonstration project oriented. And why not teach the technology? Why not teach the science while you're trying to deal with some very real problems? We can't afford the luxury of these isolated labs anymore. We've got some really pressing problems, so it's kind of all hands on deck. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Maury. So another question I have here is from Melissa.
Uh-huh.
The question is, how can we bridge the gap from science not acknowledging the spiritual aspect of the world? They believe because spirits can be measured by particles, then it is anonymously versus factual.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's the really tough one. And I'll be honest with you, I think without going real deep into some theoretical physics I don't necessarily claim to understand, I think that the people we work with if we're going to work with them, just have to understand, Elisa, that on this issue of the spiritual dimension of this world, their failure to sense that or understand that is their problem, not ours. And so I'm not going to make it our problem. I'm going to say, if you want to work with us, you're going to have to understand that there are certain protocols that we will go through before we do things. And I want to point out, let's think about very practical. Remember what I said about indigenuity. The difference between a modern farmer and an indigenous farmer who's using indigenous traditions is, I'm going to wager a bet, because I don't think I'll lose, is you would find out for the people working with those plants, working with those seeds, that there are prayers that accompany that activity. And there's an acknowledgement of that life, of that spirit, and an asking of cooperation. It's the same thing with hunting. You know, how many hunters, you know, make offerings and say prayers, not just that they're going to get the biggest 12-point buck they ever shot in their life, but actually lay down tobacco and ask their relative, the deer or the antelope, I hate to take your life, but my family needs food. Would you be willing to give your life to me as a hunter? I respect you. I will honor you. That's the difference. You're not living among resources, you're living with relatives, and you honor that and you respect that. And so I think, Elisa, thank you for the question. I don't have the answer to that one. I will just say that I think you can find people at Purdue, you can find people at the best universities in the world who will respect that feature of work that you might want to do. And you know, that's as it should be. If they won't respect it, then you probably need to find another place to be. But I think that, you know, it's certainly not a black and white issue. There are still people who are pretty hard pressed and they don't believe in anything, you know, this spiritual stuff or any of this aspect of the sacred that we might talk about. And I say, that's their problem. It's not your problem. Don't let it be your problem. Mm-hmm. And if it is, then you need to find a different way to work, or a different place, or different people to work with.
Okay, thank you so much. I see that David has his hand up. So David, if you want to go ahead and unmute yourself, you can ask a question.
Hi, am I coming through? So one of the things we've seen a lot in ecological research in the last few years has been the basically sensorizing of a great deal of the world, whether that's, you know, satellites, camera traps, soil chemistry, all these different kinds of things. I wonder whether you see that as kind of helpful in terms of the relationship between people and the rest of the natural world, as kind of bringing more information together, or kind of a sort of a harmful intermediate layer that disrupts that connection?
That's a really excellent question. And I think that depends on how you use it, you know. And I think, again, that this technology is very, I can think of a few technologies that I just say, not a good idea. I don't think we should probably be working on certain kinds of technologies. But remote sensing, land satellites, all of the kinds of geospatial analysis we can do. I think, obviously, we know a lot of that stuff got put up there probably for military and national defense and security purposes. But that doesn't mean we can't use some of that data to look at questions and understand questions that are relative of importance to particular peoples in a place. Now, I will say this, there's one really interesting question that comes up, and it's being talked about now, I think just in the last couple of years, and that is this issue of who has the right to know. And so, you know, there are indigenous people's lands who you could get the right satellite, the right computer, and you could get detailed information about their lands, about their landscape, about the plants that are there, the animals that are there, the habitats, you know, all of this information. But just because you collected it, do you have a right to unilaterally determine how it's going to be used? I think that raises a really interesting question. So this project I'm working on right now, we're going to create a whole, as a part of this big project, a whole area of what we're calling data sovereignty, and how we're going to deal with this issue of tagging and, you know, kind of making it clear levels at which certain kinds of knowledge can be shared. And that, by the way, is a fascinating area. We need some really people with good minds to start thinking about, because here would be another counterpoint. And Patrick would know about this, you know, among Muscogee peoples, but, you know, in our traditions, it's not, there isn't this kind of universal assumption that all knowledge is good and everyone should have knowledge. No, because having knowledge comes with responsibilities, and some people will never be given certain knowledge because they might not be seen as responsible enough to hold that knowledge. And that is an issue. So I like your question, and I think it's a great one. And I probably took that a little obliquely, not exactly where you were asking it. But the point I wanted to make is I think that technology can be used in a good way by indigenous people, but the people who collect that need to visit with the indigenous people about how that will be used, not just unilaterally say, oh, hi, we've found out this about where you live. We're gonna dam that river because we need another hydroelectric, you know, power generation dam, and there goes your homeland. Of course, that's going on in Amazonia today as we speak.
Yes, thank you. That, again, that was an excellent question. And I would just add that some of our Purdue students that are here, that are pursuing their master's or PhD, they have this strong desire to focus their thesis or their dissertation topics on an issue relevant to their tribal community. And I know some students have been very, very thoughtful in terms of bringing plants that they want to use, plants, animals, or anything of that nature from their homeland, bring it back, and then they make offerings. But the strong desire to take it back, they want to make sure that whatever knowledge they bring here is returned back to their home community. And I remember a student had some resistance with that. She talked about how she was very concerned because they wanted to keep the plants here, but she really held her ground and she was able to take those plants back. So I think it does show the difference between our indigenous researchers here at Purdue and, you know, the thought of how they want to make sure that the plants have life and they want to take it back home. So I do appreciate that comment. One last question here I want to read from our chat group.
Okay.
It was from Samantha. Let me see, make sure I got the name right. And I just lost it. Here we go. Sorry, I clicked on something here and I lost it. But Samantha is, her Her question is, I want to be a grassroots environmental lobbyist with a focus on Indigenous people and how pollution affects community health, such as environmental justice issues. How would you recommend someone get into this? She's graduating in December, and her last comment is, I am really passionate about this, but don't know the best way or track to advocate for Indigenous people that is most influential and impactful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. You know, that's a great question, and I'm going to give you an answer that you're going to have to think about, because at first it might not seem very useful. But I think the best way to build a relationship and find opportunities is to start going where Indigenous peoples go. Find those in academia, find those forums. We have, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. We have SACNAS. You have regional conferences and things. And when you go, I'd say just pay attention. Don't go running up to people and say, hey, I just got a degree from Purdue and I'm ready to really come help your people. And we've had a lot of people who showed up at our doorsteps and said, hey, have I got a deal for you? Boy, we're going to help you do this. And the first reaction sometimes you get is people kind of stand off. It's like, well, who are you? We don't know you. And so you need to kind of build some relationships and not be a stranger. And I'd say the best thing you can do is listen, pay attention. You'd be surprised how much you will learn. And there will be a person like you with the commitment you've got, there will be some opportunities. Just don't go into it, charging into it and until you've got some relationships built and some friendships and some knowledge. And if you go places and there are Native people and you pay attention and you listen, you'd be surprised how open they can be. By the same time, I've seen people come in with the best intentions who are very mission driven. And, boy, we've got to talk about this and we need to, and, I'm here to help you do this right now. And that just doesn't go over real well. They're going like, who are you? And why are you here acting that way? And so that would be my advice.
Thank you.
You bet.
Okay, great. Well, I think we are at the end of our program, and I again would like to thank you for joining us, all our participants that are here. Special thanks to all our sponsors for contributing: the Division of Diversity Inclusion, the Center for the Environment, the Natural Resources and Environmental Science Interdisciplinary Undergraduate Program, Native American Indigenous Studies Program, and the Purdue University Student Chapter of the American Indian Science and Engineering Society. We are pleased that you're able to join us, and we will send a follow-up email just to, again, thank you for your participation, but also to ask for your feedback. So we'll ask just a couple of questions, if you wouldn't mind just filling it out, and just to give us some information as how you felt about this presentation. Thank you, Dr. Wildcat, and we really appreciate you spending the afternoon with us. We'll be online for just a little bit longer, so if anybody would like to join us, but thanks. I just want to give everybody the formal thank you, and Deb will end the recording so we can we'll be here a little bit longer.
Well, thank you, everyone. I've really enjoyed this. Great questions, and remember, there's work for everyone. So let's just roll up our sleeves and get to work.